If there's one piece of music that is quintessentially New York City, it's surely this one, Rhapsody in Blue by George Gershwin. There's a reason that Woody Allen chose the piece to open his 1979 film Manhattan, which, by the way, isn't where these shots are from. They're a montage of time-lapses by a more recent New Yorker, YouTuber Casey Neistat. But you can still feel the same magic, the same connection. There's something about this music that has woven its way into the hearts of listeners ever since it was first performed in a concert given by jazz band leader Paul Whiteman in New York in 1924, to an audience that included an amazing collection of musical luminaries from all sides of the musical divide. Classical composers like Sergei Rachmaninoff and Igor Stravinsky sat alongside the stride pianist Willie the Lion Smith and march band leader John Philip Sousa. And that cross-genre, cross-cultural appeal really became the point. Rhapsody in Blue is just so like New York. It's the sophisticated and the brash rubbing shoulders side by side. It's the first truly melting pot piece for a melting pot city. Gershwin's central dilemma when writing the piece was how to turn his propensity for writing a good tune into a more substantial piece of music, the fully fledged jazz concerto that Whiteman had asked for. A piece, in other words, that lasted more than a few minutes but somehow didn't just sound like a predictable medley of one tune after another. Because writing tunes was undoubtedly one of Gershwin's greatest talents. His first big hit was a show tune called Swanee in 1919, which Al Johnson, a famous Broadway singer of the day, heard Gershwin perform at a party and decided to sing in one of his shows.
I've been away from you a long time. I never thought I'd miss you so.
And many of the tunes Gershwin wrote over the next 15 years or so, whether it's Lady Be Good, I Got Rhythm, Let's Call the Whole Thing Off, or Embraceable You, they've become jazz standards, tunes everyone knows, plays and loves.
Embrace me, my sweet embraceable you.
And in Rhapsody in Blue, the melodies are undoubtedly a key part of the piece's success. The composer Leonard Bernstein, no stranger to genre hopping himself, said of the piece,
"The themes are terrific, inspired, God-given. I don't think there's been such an inspired melodist on this earth since Tchaikovsky."
His next sentence was slightly less gracious.
But if you want to speak of a composer, that's another matter.
But we'll come back to that. And of course, most of these show tunes would have a fairly standard structure. Typically it'll be a 16 or 32 bars, there'll be an A section, a repeat of the A section, maybe with a little variety thrown in, then a contrasting B section, sometimes known as the bridge or the middle eight, and finally a return to the A, so a nice simple AA-BA form. And the simplicity of this structure is one of the keys to its popularity. It has just the right amount of repetition, a little sense of variety in the middle, before the comfort of a return to the familiar. But the very thing that makes it a success makes it difficult to use for Gershwin's purposes. It's a closed form, it has a beginning, a middle and an end. Finish the end of one cycle and you've got nothing to do, nowhere to go, other than repeat the cycle again or just go on to something else. And I think this shows the inherent problem of genre hopping. These structures are there for a reason. Move too far away from them and you risk destroying the thing itself. Stick to them too rigidly and, well, you're just left with a series of tunes which don't really add up to anything greater. The sweet spot between these two alternatives is pretty hard to find. So what's Gershwin's solution? Well, he certainly doesn't abandon the tunes. There are 5 main tunes in the piece, each of which has been given a name over the years by academics. There's the famous opening tune, the one with the clarinet glissando, which is known as the ritornello as it comes back most often in the piece. Then there's the train theme. The stride theme. The shuffle theme. And finally, the love theme. Each of these themes, when we hear it fully stated, seems to have that AABA shape. Here's the full ritornello theme, although there's something a little bit different about that last A section, which we'll come to in a minute. So let's follow this theme at the start of the piece and see how Gershwin uses it. And from the outset, he doesn't state it in full, we just hear the first phrase in B-flat major. So then there's some connecting material and a hint of the stride theme. But now we've already changed key, so now we hear the first phrase again, but now it's on A-flat in the muted trumpet. Then there's 2 more bars of connecting material, and we've moved again, G-flat major. So we keep hearing the same fragment of the tune, but it's always on the move, changing key every few bars. Next, after a longer transition, the piano gets its turn, and we finally hear the full version of the ritornello theme, in yet another new key, A major now. But even now, Gershwin gently pulls the harmonic rug out from under our feet at the start of the B section, so that it leads not back home to the key it started in, but to yet another new key, this time it's C minor. So we've heard the main theme now 5 times, and every time it's been in a different key. Gershwin here is following a rule I always tell students. What you get up to in the opening of a piece sets the tone for the rest of the piece. If you start it one way, say with all of those AABA tunes stated in full, it's very hard then to move beyond that. But if you start with something that straight away breaks into fragments or quickly changes harmony, then you're much freer after that to suddenly stop in the middle of a phrase and move on somewhere else without it seeming out of place. And fragmentation is another key trick that Gershwin gets up to here. We just saw an example of fragmentation in that last phrase. The theme starts, but then you get these 2 lines in the music. That's called a caesura. It's a symbol that tells the performer to cut the phrase off and restart in the next bar. And Rhapsody in Blue is full of these kind of moments, little unexpected interruptions and diversions. So here, for example, we're joining the stride theme and we're on the second A of its AABA structure. So it proceeds in an orderly fashion to its B section, but we only get the first bar of the final A before it moves into a sequence and then it dissolves into something completely different. So with this kind of approach, we still get to hear our Gershwin tunes, but they're never allowed to complete. They always end up breaking up, fragmenting, moving off in a new direction. But alongside these popular elements, there were other aspects of the piece that pushed it far closer to something more like a traditional classical work. First and foremost, despite the jazzy styles, it felt like a concerto. Many of the piano passages and the ways it interacts with the ensemble would not have felt out of place in a work by Grieg or Tchaikovsky. The main solos are full of typically classical and decidedly unjazzy rubato. And the piano part is also full of traditional classical character types like agitato or scherzando. So while the band plays its foxtrots in a fairly straightforward style, the soloist takes up the tunes and transforms them into something that feels more like a traditional heroic soloist in a piano concerto. Gershwin seems to have seen his work as a way of synthesizing a new, truly American art form, an American Rhapsody as he originally called it, by mixing African American traditions like ragtime and jazz with the European traditions of concert music. The American soul, as he wrote earnestly in a 1926 essay for Theatre magazine, is black and white, all colours and all souls unified. It was a grand vision, but also perhaps a slightly naive one. As many have since noted, Gershwin's success overshadowed any number of equally talented African American artists, from James P. Johnson to Fats Waller to even Duke Ellington himself. And as Claudia Roth-Pierpont noted in The New Yorker, the tide of history was also moving in a new direction. In the fall of 1924, the return of Aaron Copland from his studies in Paris and the arrival of Louis Armstrong from the clubs of Chicago began to tear the ideal of an American synthesis apart. Serious music and jazz went their distinct ways, a composer's art and a performer's art. eternal verity and restless improvisation, leaving Gershwin in a no man's land that came to be known with a curl of the lip as pops. So the work has found itself in a curious limbo. For jazz musicians, it doesn't really fit the narrative of a genre that became centred on improvisation. But the piece holds an even bigger challenge for classical music, where the veneration of both composer and score still holds firm to this day. Which one of the many versions of the piece that exist count as the real thing? So the version of the piece most often heard in concert halls today was the one orchestrated in 1942, 5 years after Gershwin's death, by Ferdi Groffet, who also orchestrated the 1926 theatre orchestra version and the original 1924 jazz band version. Gershwin himself only wrote a 2-piano score. In the version for jazz band, the pianist, with all those cadenzas and rubato, seems more like an interloper from the classical world, but in the orchestral version, which many people feel goes too far in smoothing out the jazzier colours of the ensemble, the pianist seems more like the one true jazzy element. So which of these is the real Rhapsody in Blue? And it's equally confusing when it comes to the piece's form. Gershwin's original score lasts about 15 minutes, but the 2 times he recorded it in his lifetime, it was in an abridged version lasting only 8 or 9 minutes. Of course, that was mainly so that it would fit on 2 sides of a 78 RPM record, but still, in some sense, you could say it has more of the composer's official stamp of approval than the sprawling orchestral version we're used to, and which Pierpont says sounds less like 20s symphonic jazz than like 50s symphonised Freud. Gershwin's giddy clarinet has become a cat in heat, his lilting central melody a swollen hymn to Eros. The larky gaiety of the original is a wholly different experience. So all of this poses a terrible dilemma for classical critics and commentators. How can you analyse and judge a work when you can't even agree what the work is? So to continue with Bernstein's quote from earlier, Rhapsody in Blue is not a real composition in the sense that whatever happens in it must seem inevitable. You can cut parts of it without affecting the whole, you can remove any of these stuck together sections and the piece still goes on as bravely as before. It can be a 5-minute piece or a 12-minute piece. And in fact, all these things are being done to it every day, and it's still the Rhapsody in Blue. So according to Bernstein, Gershwin failed at the very thing he set out to do. He didn't manage to meld those great melodies into a meaningful, larger structure. And yet, he must have done something right. As David Schiff says in his excellent Cambridge handbook to the piece, if a musical work continues to be played for 3 generations after its premiere, just how flawed can its form be? And in studying the piece for this video, I've come to appreciate how much care Gershwin put into creating a coherent piece. So while he does all that work to break up his melodies, Gershwin is at the same time constantly looking for ways to bind them together. So for example, the bass line we heard earlier under the stride theme is a kind of pre-echo of the love theme. And the themes themselves have many features in common. They all have a similar kind of bluesy harmony, an emphasis on the flattened 7th, and a lot of use of major and minor thirds. Or look here at how Gershwin connects 2 different themes, the shuffle theme and the love theme, through a common rhythm. Da, 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 da. In the piece there's a connecting passage that links the 2 themes and keeps the rhythm in our ears as the music slows down, so that when the love theme arrives it sounds not really like a new theme but like something emerging naturally out of what's come before. But let's end by going right back to the start. If you listen to the 1924 recording, you can hear the original clarinetist Ross Gorman, who apparently was just larking around with the opening B-flat major scale Gershwin had written, and because Gershwin liked what he did, he'd inadvertently turned it into the iconic glissando that we all know. so one of the most familiar iconic aspects of the piece was just an afterthought. If you listen to that recording, there's also far more of the sound of traditional klezmer music in the sound of the clarinet than you hear in most modern interpretations, although Gorman wasn't Jewish, and Gershwin himself apparently had little knowledge of klezmer despite his own Jewish origins. But perhaps that confusing pile-up of cultures and styles offers the best metaphor for the piece as a whole. Maybe, as some say, Gershwin wasn't a true jazz musician, and yet, as we've seen, many of his songs went on to become standards that form the very DNA of jazz. Maybe Rhapsody in Blue is not a classical piece, but it's one of the most performed by classical orchestras around the world. Something that doesn't easily fit into a category can be easy to pour scorn on. It's confusing, it doesn't do things the way they've always been done. But if it has something of value, as Rhapsody in Blue clearly does, it'll just pick itself up, brush off its shoulders, and carry on. It's a melting pot piece with all the joys, contradictions, disappointments, and excitements that entails. And I would say of the composer, just like the great city he was born in, if you're tired of Gershwin, you're tired of life. Oh, I'm getting wet. So, part of the reason I wanted to do this film was that 2020 marks 95 years since the first publication of Rhapsody in Blue, which means that finally it's now out of copyright. At least the original Gershwin two-piano piece is. I think some of the orchestrations may still remain in copyright. The Gershwin estate was one of the signatories behind the Copyright Extension Act, the Sonny Bono Act, and everyone's worried that it would keep getting extended indefinitely. So it's great for now, at least. It's in the public domain where it belongs. Whether at some point they'll try and claw it back, it's quite possible. It's been done before. But for now, we're all free to enjoy and rearrange the two-piano version and do what we like with it. Anyway, if you enjoyed the video, do please like and subscribe, and don't forget to hit the notification bell so that you get reminders of forthcoming videos. If you'd really like to support the channel, then do consider joining my patrons over at Patreon, because they really do make the channel possible. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. I'm going back indoors now.